Right, good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to see such a good audience here this evening for Aristotle's inaugural lecture. Because there are often new faces from outside the university, I always introduce myself. I'm Trevor Macmillan. I have the great privilege and usually pleasure of being the Vice-Chancellor of Keele University. It is fantastic to see you all here, and again, as I always say, this is an important marker for Keele. To have the ability to introduce our new members of staff, new professors, and their expertise is a very valuable thing for a university to do. In fact, one of the strange things this evening, this is actually the second inaugural lecture of Aristotle that I've introduced, because I had the pleasure of introducing his at Lancaster when he got his chair there. I have to say we do them better here. A completely different format, but his lecture on that day was notable by the technology that did work, and I think we might see a little bit of that this evening. But Aristotle was born in Greece at a very interesting time in that country's history, when it was indeed under the rule of a military junta. And he studied history and archaeology at the University of Athens, and he graduated from there in 1992. While studying at during those times for his PhD, he absolutely vowed that he would never do any academic study of Greece, and we'll see how well that held up. But he did hold that promise for some time, and actually he has, during his PhD and then subsequently, done a lot of work on the comparative history and politics. His PhD thesis, indeed, was on the ideology, origins, territorial expansion in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. So he then did move on. He came to UK, to Edinburgh, Bristol, and Lancaster, and was indeed at Lancaster for 13 years before moving here in 2016. So he has spent a lot of his academic career, indeed, researching into the comparative and transnational history of interwar fascism, and I think we're going to hear some of that. Importantly, I think for Keele, he actually makes a very specific point of stressing the interdisciplinarity of the work that he does. And for a university like Keele, the size we are, we should be good at that. We should be able to break down many of the boundaries that some of the more siloed big universities struggle to get through. And so that's an important contribution that I think he makes it at Keele. My reference to technology at the beginning is real, in that he is unashamedly admits to try and introduce as much technology into his teaching and his lectures as possible. And I think, again, that shows a dynamism and an ambition, really, to keep up with the trends, and in particular around with the students. Since the global financial crisis, he has been expanding his work into different aspects of fascism and extremism, and that has indeed led him back to thinking about Greece a little bit more. So today he's going to explore one of the broad questions that he's been asked extensively since that turn of the new millennium, and that is whether the world is sliding back to that age of the extremes, like it did in the 1930s. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Aristotle Callas to give his inaugural lecture this evening.
Good evening. I hope this is working. I think it is working. Thank you very, very much for the very generous introduction. I always feel that it's almost like an out-of-body experience. Who is this person who's being introduced? It's somebody over there. I thank you all for coming today. It's actually quite humbling to see so many people that I don't recognize, I don't know, as well as my colleagues, some students, brave students, who have come here today. So it is humbling to have such a good audience in a, on a not very cold and not very terrible winter day, but surely at a dark evening like this. It is indeed the case that I've come to Kiel fairly recently. I've been here for a year and a half, and I came to Kiel after a long period of Lancaster University, looking forward to an institution that was very proudly interdisciplinary, that was stimulating both in terms of its intellectual life but also in terms of its interaction with students, and it was a humane place. Well, I can say that a year and a half afterwards, I have found an intellectually stimulating, proudly interdisciplinary, and exceptionally humane place for which I am honored and at the same time very, very thankful to everybody else. There is a bit of a cryptic title there, and hopefully we will be able to go into this in some detail in the coming 45 minutes or so, that hopefully I won't speak for much longer. So I am asking two different kinds of questions. One is a very specific question about fascism, the 1930s and now. The other one is about, it's a broader question about history, the historian, and the past. And this kind of idea of history repeating or not repeating, I've tried very, very hard to avoid reproducing cliches in my lecture. It's very tempting. Those who don't study history are blah, blah, blah. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. You see, I'm already falling into this. That is the case. But essentially, the broader question that I'm talking about is a question about a historical déjà vu, which is quite a fitting way to start this lecture, and I can promise you that it wasn't predetermined, because as the Vice-Chancellor said, I do have a sense of a little bit of déjà vu right now in an inaugural address introduced by him, but this is the kind of idea. But let me always start with something that is very much part of the context in which we're having this discussion right now. First of all, a very short-term context. Only a few days ago, we marked, like we do every year, on the 27th of January, Holocaust Memorial Day. Holocaust Memorial Day is marking two different things. It's marking, in particular, the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, but it's also marking a general point where the secretive, brutally modern operation that the Nazis had set up to exterminate millions of different people, primarily but not exclusively Jews, was first opened up to the public gaze. So it is important that we have this commemoration, and it's important for me to start it not only by reminding you what you already know, but by trying to make a general point about this topic and Holocaust Memorial Day. This, in many ways, we are told, this commemoration is marking also the dark 20th century, a century that has been littered with a lot of episodes that defy conventional categorizations, and conventional modes of interpretation. Had I been given this lecture 10 years ago or 7 years ago, I can promise you, and I think the Vice-Chancellor is a witness, it's not the same lecture that I've given 7 years ago. But had I given that lecture over there, I suppose it would have been a slightly different slanted lecture, because since that time, a lot of things have happened. In fact, to use a quote by one of the historians, British historians, history picked up pace in the recent times in many ways, particularly in the last 2 years, but also very, very recently. So the context in which this discussion is taking place is overshadowed by a number of events, not just the Brexit referendum, not just the electoral victory of Donald J. Trump, but events that take place in Hungary, in very recently in the Czech Republic and also in Austria. Just to mention only a few. I could have filled up the whole slide, but I have to keep it like this. So when the Holocaust Memorial Day hinges on that notion of never again, we have to ask ourselves what we mean by that. Because why do we use that word? It's got a very interesting history. It wasn't there from the beginning. It's a word that has changed different contexts. It was developed in a completely different context, but it became associated with that call of remembering the past and vowing not to repeat it. So what exactly is that never again? Does it really say that we are certain that this is not going to happen? I don't think that's possible. I think humanity has said many times never again, and that never again proved transitional, ephemeral, fragile, in the end even defeated by the human condition. So it can't be that, but it could be that we are talking about it as a vow, try not to. But why would we use that word? And this is very much at the heart of what I will be talking today, is something for which we have many times since the 1930s said never again. Is that likely to be happening again? Can it be happening again? And is it happening again? The three interrelated questions. The Vice-Chancellor said a few things about me. I won't repeat them too much, but I think it is important to give a little bit of context to my own research. I'm a historian, and I am a historian who is proudly committed to comparative and interdisciplinary research. But I did enter the fray of the historical profession at a time of crisis of confidence for the whole discipline. This is a kind of crisis of epistemological dimensions, whether history is scientifically grounded, whether there is one truth or multiple truths, whether there is something like a truth to be discovered in the past, or whether everything is a function of narration, subjective, in the eye of the beholder, and so on and so forth. So it was an interesting time because I was exposed from the very first moment to those debates, which a lot of historians found fundamentally destabilizing. But as you heard, I also grew up in Greece. And of course, I grew up in Greece in the middle of a military dictatorship. One of my first and very, very powerful images was reading a book with my mother, and that book had one page that somebody had superimposed a piece of paper on it. And I was asking my mother what it was, and she wouldn't tell me. And one day, of course, as kids do, I took a knife and peeled off, and I discovered that it was the symbol you see on the left, which is the emblem, the logo, if you like, of the military junta that ruled Greece from 67 to 74. But I do remember my mother who used to say to me, these are bad people. So it was very much at the heart of this discussion. What does it mean? Why am I saying this? I think certain cultures have got a particular relationship with history. And I think in Greece, growing up in Greece, it's a bit hard to avoid history, and I don't mean here, don't misunderstand me, I don't mean the Parthenon and the stereotypes of Greece. I mean history seeping through your pores, whether you like it or not, and it's something that's happening even now. History is big, it's a big thing in Greece. So whether you like it or not, you are confronted by this. The photo I'm showing you here is 2 weeks old, is from a big rally that was called, it's not a concert, it's not a political rally, it's a rally that was called in the second city of Greece, Salonika, to protest about the fact that Macedonia is Greek and only Greek. And as you can see, a lot of people did turn up. So it is something very, very much at the center of the way in which people understand the world around them. I was also made sure from the beginning that we get that moment to choose our title, which is a very interesting moment. Because however mundane it may sound, it's also a moment where you, as a professor, think of how you position yourself vis-a-vis the body of knowledge that is associated with your discipline. So I've always thought myself as a modern, but also a contemporary historian. And a contemporary historian, contemporary history can be seen as a bit of a contradiction in many ways. I do remember not only when I was at the university that I was told that history ends in 1945, but I am aware of the fact that up until not very long ago in certain universities, modern history began with the fall of Rome. So that was the definition of that in so many ways. But contemporary historian, I'm a contemporary historian not only because of what a historian of the beginning of the 20th century said, Benedetto Croce said that all good history is contemporary history, but because I feel that contemporary history can mean two different things, and both are very, very important. The one is, as historians, we study history, that's what we're told when we have our training, as it happened. So we're studying the history as it was contemporary for a group of people who experienced it in the first place. But also, it is important that we study contemporary history. We study it because there is an interest in that history that is also informed by our contemporary preoccupations, our contemporary needs and desires and ambitions and things that we fear in the future, but also things that we aspire for in the future. So in that respect, I think it is very important. Last but not least, I am a historian of extremism. And you will indulge me for a few slides here. I love that function in Google where you can search for a word and it tells you through some very, very complicated algorithm, I'm sure, how the use of that word has changed over time. So this is, if you can see it, at the bottom is the use of the word extremism, and it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. It maps very much on the existence of the so-called century of extremes, the Second World War, and so on and so forth. But what you can see, and I think is very interesting, is the slight decline of the term towards the second half of the 20th century, and then it picks up again in the turn of the new millennium. I think that's very important. I entered the study of extremism by studying fascism. And I entered the study of fascism at a very, very interesting time. Since the Second World War, historians dealing with fascism were very reluctant to take fascism seriously. There was a historian such as Dennis Mack Smith, part of the Oxbridge academic profession of history, who famously said that Mussolini was a clown. Not so much with Hitler, obviously. Hitler was a different story because of the legacy of the Holocaust that I started this lecture with. But there was this idea that Nazism and fascism was propaganda, was devoid of ideological substance. And I think I entered this study of fascism at a time where a number of very interesting things were happening in the area of fascism studies. So a determination to take fascism seriously, a determination to give it ideological substance. And this is the way in which I became fascinated with the study of that phenomenon. I think it's very, very important to keep it in that respect, not to deal with the historical experience of fascism as a parenthesis of history, as a rogue 20 years that came out of nowhere and disappeared in thin air. A lot of people, when I was entering this study of fascism, were still repeating this mantra, which is still happening. You can read it here and there. Fascism was defeated in 1945, and I think there's so many things that are wrong with this particular statement. So it was a very interesting time that fascism somehow had continuities that predated what we call historic fascism, but also survived its theoretical or practical demise in 1945. But as I was studying more and more the history of fascism and being exposed to arguments about the rise and success of fascism, causal arguments about the economic crisis, historians love crisis, is a very, very handy toolkit, but historians of fascism love it a little bit more and a little bit too much sometimes, I would say. I started looking at fascism from a slightly different point of view. Because fascism is extremism by virtue of someone or some people who term it extremism. So there is a center, there is a moderation, there is a something that we call we, and then it is those extremists out there. And I thought that this is a very unsatisfactory way of trying to come to terms with why that particular ideology, that radical startup, to use a very contemporary term from the 1920s, which had nothing predetermined in its becoming a success, how did it manage to become a main force? And it's at that time that I started thinking of fascism in relation to another concept, the concept of mainstream. Now, mainstream is picking up, as you can see, but it's a much more recent event, as it were. And I think that's very interesting as well. Mainstream is one of those concepts that we use a lot, and we all assume we know what it is, and we evade defining, we evade talking about it because it is complicated, it's dynamic, it changes over time, and so on and so forth. But where is the problem? The problem is that we agonize about the minutiae of extremism. So we term something as extremist, we study it from left and right and center, from every possible angle, and we try and understand it. But at the same time, we exceptionalize it. We say that this is different from us, where actually my whole approach and the way in which I found more useful in coming to terms with fascism is not to close the door to the suggestion, however unsettling it might be, that fascism back then, and in all its permutations, may be rooted in some respects in continuities with our cultures back then and even up until now. And the same point that I make about fascism also relates to another one of the areas in which at some point I spent quite a lot of time, the study of genocide, again comparative, but again starting from the interwar period. To exceptionalize something means to close the door practically to the ability to draw interesting continuities or similarities with other things that happen. So the mind of the comparative historian always seeks for those comparisons, not for similarities, seeks for those comparisons. So here is where that chapter in the history of my research, the hub of my research, as it were, happens. On the 23rd of March, 1919, the photo is actually one of the very few and slightly disputed photo, I should say, but it's better than none, of that meeting that took place in a small square in Milan. You can see at the above the announcement in the party newspaper, and the founding of the fascist movement. On the 23rd of March 1919, a small square, not many people. And as I called fascism a radical startup because it was one of many fringe political forces, one of many fringe ideologies that have appeared and disappeared without, in some cases, not even meriting a footnote in history books. But fascism did something that all radical startups do. It challenged the mainstream. It challenged the liberal mainstream. And it challenged, which is what it did as well very successfully, it challenged its only possible opponent in this challenge of the mainstream, which was the socialists and the communists at the time, at a particular period where Italy in particular and Europe in general were gripped by that paranoia, that fear that the world is about to be seized by the communist revolution starting from the Soviet Union, from Russia in 1917. And of course, what we see from 1919 to 1922, there is a rather exponential and unlikely story of success that we cannot say in any way that it was either predetermined or even likely. This is the important thing we should keep in mind. But what is another way? How can we interpret this? We can say that the fascists were very good, Mussolini was very charismatic, his supporters were very devoted to the cause, and so on and so forth. This is one very legitimate and defensible way of explanation and interpretation. But another way, and not mutually exclusive, complementary way, is to actually ask, why did fascism succeed not just in 1922, because You probably know the story. Mussolini did not seize power. He set up a march on Rome to seize power, but he didn't get to become prime minister like this. He was appointed by the elites of the time. So there was nothing predetermined in that respect. But why did fascism afterwards show such staying power? In Italy, later on in Germany, later on in so many countries of Europe. Could it be that some crucial ideological themes that fascism was putting forward as an ideology were striking the right chord with some aspects, fears, ambitions of the so-called mainstream society? Now, we could say yes or no to this answer. It's an interesting angle, but it's also a rather unsettling angle to have, because essentially you're saying that fascism has got certain ideological or cultural or other continuities with that thing that we call mainstream. And of course, we study the fascism as a historical phenomenon. At some point, every historian of fascism will be confronted with that question. So what? Fascism died in 1945. Could it be that fascism is something contemporary? Could it be that fascism is a diachronic thing, something that existed before, will exist afterwards? Some psychological interpretations, for example, put forward that idea that fascism is in many ways part of a human pathology, one way or another, and so on and so forth. So this is the thing. Is fascism contemporary? Well, historians of fascism had a fairly quiet life in the first millennium, in the first decade of that millennium. Yes, there were radical right-wing movements and so on and so forth, but we were all gearing up for the moment of glory. You know, the First World War historians had the moment of glory in 2014 and still have it up until this year and including this year. So fascism historians, 2019, 2022, it was a long-term project. And then, of course, a number of things did happen. And these are also part from my personal experience. In 2009, there was a referendum that took place in Switzerland that, surprisingly, there was a cautionary tale in history. Everybody thought that people would vote no. Every opinion poll was saying people would vote no. The referendum asked the Swiss people whether there should be a ban on minaret construction. And everybody thought 60% no and everything. On the night of the referendum, 57, not even 52% of people voted for this to happen. And that kind of brought back this whole discussion. Is Islamophobia the new anti-Semitism and so on and so forth? So we started being drawn into this discussion. Then, of course, around that time, a little bit before, a little bit afterwards, the economic crisis struck. And immediately, when the severity of that crisis became obvious, is this Back to the Future? Is this 1929 all over again? And does this mean a rise of extremism? Well, a little bit later on, crisis came a little bit closer to the place where I grew up, in Greece. And of course, in 2012, one political party called the Golden Dawn got 8% of the vote out of nowhere, and there I did break my promise that to myself that I had given earlier on, never, ever to talk about this. But it's not just me. It's not just the historians of fascism who are thinking in terms of parallels, analogies, and so on. It's everybody else. I mean, there is again somebody. Indulge me for a little bit. I've suffered during those years. Okay, history is something you study, and sometimes history is something you feel. Again, as I said, on your body in so many ways. But here is the then finance minister, the rock star finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, and he had a number of things. But I'm just reproducing one quote. He loved making those historical analogies. He absolutely perfected the art. Here is one quote. I was trying to find the video. So he talks about what's happening now is like the period of the military coup in Greece in 1967. But there was this absolutely unforgettable moment when he's having a press conference with the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, and he's talking to him, and he says, you have to help us, because if you don't help us, when I go back to Greece, there is a right-wing movement, and we all know what happens when economic crisis makes people desperate, and what this leads to in that respect, talking to the German finance minister. So he was taking forward all these ideas, and he was thriving in that kind of historical analogy. From that point onwards, historians of fascism became as it were, a little bit of celebrities of the media every now and then, because we had many opportunities. We had opportunities from the right-wing populists, not one, but many of them, and the club is growing. What I love about this slide is, and it is part of the original slide, is the finger on the very right. You don't know who this is because we don't know where the next person is going to be, but it is more and more and more people in that respect. And of course, this. And not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. 3 hits. Announcing to run, winning the nomination, winning the election. So one quiet morning in August 2016, I got a phone call from a journalist and said, would you like to comment on something? I said, what is that? I said, is the real Donald Trump? And they used that word, which is Donald Trump's hook on one of the two, because of course, like a sovereign, he has 2 bodies. He is the President of the United States and Donald Trump. You get, is he a fascist? And apparently, as I found out later, there was a lot of discussion amongst, this journalist was working for a newspaper that had asked about 20 of my colleagues. Some people I knew, some people I didn't, but so on and so forth. And then it became a whole industry. Every other week there was some kind of research. And that was before winning the elections, of course, yeah? So we are thinking in terms of historical analogies. It is hard to resist the temptation, but I would say it's not a bad temptation. It is actually inviting us to think more constructively about the relationship between past and present. And I think that is very interesting as well. Look at this example. Oops, no, I was meant to say. Look at this example. This, I have to say, I found the photo without a caption, but I suppose it is part of a protest against the planned visit of the US president into the UK. What I find really striking is not the picket at the back, trying to make the point about Trump being racist. There is one that thankfully you can't see from here, but there was very much part of the caricature of a Donald Trump with certain facial hair that made an analogy to another historical figure that this discussion is very pertinent with. But it's the first picket, it's the first message, that somehow appeasing Donald Trump in that respect, appeasing the United States and everything, is a rerun of what happened in the 1930s. Now, we do think in patterns. I am told, I'm not obviously an expert on this at all, I am told that it is an evolutionary critical function. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of insecurity around us, and thinking in patterns does help enormously in that respect. Some of you are, but if you are German, you are struck by the fact that there's a particular day in history that is called Day of Fate, and that, of course, is the same day that Donald Trump was elected as President of the United States. The Kaiser abdicated, Kristallnacht, the pogrom against the Jews, took place in 1938. 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in his Munich putsch, as it were. 1923 happens as well. And of course, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then on top of that, we have the election of Donald Trump. Why do we do that? Nobody says that there is some kind of metaphysical connection. But even the fact that we are asking the question, we are alluding to some kind of pattern. And it could be a pattern that we're merely noting as an anecdote, or it could be in some cases that we are trying to make a deeper connection. So does history have a pattern in that respect? This is the broader question I wanted to ask with regard to this thing. So is history somehow linear? Does it go somewhere? Remember the title that I put for this, History Repeating or Not Repeating? In order to answer that question, we need to think, and I have to think, and we all have to think as historians about what it really means to say that history is repeating or history is not repeating. Historians have grappled with this, and not just historians, obviously, for a long, long time, from a Greek historian. Sorry, I'm not parading the Greeks here. They were important for history in that respect. Thucydides, to the Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, to Giambattista Vico, And then the usual pantheon of modern Western history, as it were, Hegel, Karl Marx. These were people who tried to come to terms with the pattern, the purpose, the direction of history, sometimes even the end of history, as it were. And they gave different interpretations. History moves, the progressive view of history. History has an end. The Marxist view of history is sort of history as a teleology, history leading somewhere inexorably, deterministically, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, towards the second half of the 19th century, this is becoming a general narrative. We have somebody, obviously, like Charles Darwin, who talks about evolution in those terms. So, you know, the modern civilization, people who view the past from the point of view of the modern times tend to think in terms of this kind of linearity, in terms of cyclicality, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that I've put Darwin there for a reason, and last, because even Darwin, towards the end of the 19th century, was experiencing some kind of second thoughts about the progressive move of history. That maybe regression was possible. That maybe it wasn't guaranteed that history will progress one way or another. And then, of course, historians picked a lot of these themes and turned them into a central thing of the historical narrative. Not so much a historian, but an interesting character. Oswald Spengler talked about the decline of the West, so things rise and fall, obviously taking cue from Edward Gibbon, who talked about the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. The passing of the great race, by Madison Grant, so on and so forth. And of course, Arnold Toynbee. And Arnold Toynbee is important to this story because he made that point about cyclical pattern of history, that civilizations rise and fall. They rise because they provide good, intelligent, effective, and out-of-the-box answers to challenges. They fall when they stop doing so. So that was a very interesting and very compelling idea behind all this thing. So back to the legitimate question. What is happening here? Are we even justified in asking this question? Is the question that was put to me by the journalist, is Donald Trump a fascist or not? Is this a legitimate question to ask? I think it is the wrong question. It's a question that I've refused to answer personally, while a lot of my colleagues have answered as well. But I think it's a question that asks something much bigger and something much more interesting. It is asking the question of whether, not whether Donald Trump is fascist. I think this we can debate ad nauseum, and we can take polemical positions and so on and so forth. But we can ask a broader question about similarities between the historical context of fascism that brought fascism to success and the historical context in which we live right now. And look at all these things. This is a fairly recent cover from The Economist and so on. Now, I said that some historians did answer that question, and you can see some of their answers. And you can find, you can fill up slides after slides after slides. There are a lot of answers, people who have taken the view. Mostly they tend to agree one way or another. Sometimes there is a little bit of a different take to this. I'm picking up one answer here, and it comes from Margaret Macmillan. And I find that very, very striking because she makes a particular point about Trump being more like Mussolini. He's not a Hitler, so he's not a serious threat. He's more like a clown. He's more like a populist and a demagogue. And I find all this positioning quite problematic in so many ways because it really doesn't answer clearly. A more interesting view is this view by Timothy Snyder, who, when was asked, a historian of both interwar Europe and interwar Russia, as it were, and also the war between the two, made the point that Trump is behaving like a 1930s dictator, but he's also finding a resonance with contemporary societies in a not dissimilar way to those dictators over there. Why is this a legitimate question to ask? Because if we are to accept that Trump could be seen as a fascist, if we are to accept that the demagogues and the populists are on the rise, then we go against the grain of one of the major orthodoxies of the whole 20th century. Historians are as culpable of this as many other analysts and scientists and researchers. We have exceptionalized the 20th century. We have taken it, in exceptionalizing it, we have taken it out of the normal pattern of history. We have used words, I've put 3 different examples there, all by very, very, very respected historians and very nuanced historians, so I'm not setting up straw people there to demolish. Eric Hobsbawm, he gave us a number of books, and in every one of his books he would use a central concept, empires, nation, and so on, capital. But he ran out of words for the 20th century, and the short, as he calls it, 20th century, from 1914 onwards, is an age of extremes. Mark Mazauer talks about a dark continent. Again, dark, exceptional, and so on and so forth. Year zero. Why is 1945 year zero? Because history is restarting, as it were, after the rogue parenthesis of fascism and genocide and totalitarianism and so on and so forth. This is the kind of narrative that was put together in order to deal with the extremity of the perceived extremity of the first half of the 20th century. So 1945 can only be welcomed as a rapture because it resumes the normal pattern of a history of progress, of reason, of liberalism, and so on and so forth. Eric Hobsbawm, of course, had a slightly different take on this. He called the first period up until 1945 the age of catastrophe. He called the second period from 1945 to the 1970s the golden years. Surely he was being ironic with regard to this because he was a Marxist historian. But this kind of contrast between the two survives very much. So this is the interesting thing. Not only have we exceptionalized the first half of the 20th century as a regression to barbarism. Benedetto Croce, that I've used earlier on, talked about a European malaise, some kind of virus that took hold of people, the people who loved Mozart and Verdi and so on and so forth, and made them behave in a particular way. So not only have we exceptionalized this, but we have also exceptionalized the change in the second half of the 20th century. We have exceptionalized it in terms of a new start, a golden era of liberalism, and so on and so forth. And that exceptionalization, that tendency of turning the second half of the 20th century into something really exceptional and unique reached its peak, of course. I don't have to tell you very much about this, but the publication of this book, The End of History as an ideological struggle, as Francis Fukuyama, much maligned, a very, very interesting thinker in so many ways. But the idea that somehow liberal democracy, capitalist liberal democracy, constitutes the end product of a progressive, linear or cyclical, but linear in that respect, history in so many ways. So 1989, of course, these books, I think, maybe in a few decades down the line, we will be talking about the 80s and the 90s, another golden era, as it were. Again, rather counterintuitively for those of us who had been there in the 80s and 90s, trying to find out what was so golden about them. But here's what I think, rather than asking about Donald Trump being a fascist, where the more interesting question is about. The world had a liberal moment, the first proper liberal moment in the aftermath of the First World War. It was a time where a lot of crazy, at that time, ideas were floating around. Banishing war, creating an international sort of government that would regulate differences between states, giving every national group a home of their own. These are very noble and honorable things. Then, of course, what happens? We get the Versailles Treaty. Okay, stay with me. That's not utopia. But, the idea was that, of course, then afterwards, liberalism has got its moment because the Allies tried to tell everybody else, including the new states in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, that they should have a liberal constitution, and a liberal constitution that protects minorities, and a liberal constitution that protects the Jews. Unheard of. Really radical things go out of the radar of what was going on at the time. It was a real liberal moment. Now, historians generally refer to the sort of mid to late 1920s as another golden era. I think maybe the Gilded Years is probably a better description, like the one that was used in American history. Golden on the outside, just a dusting of gold, but of course things were wrong on the inside. Be that as it may, we know where this liberal moment went from the late 1920s onwards. So when we're asking the question about Donald Trump and fascism, and Marine Le Pen and fascism, and Viktor Orban and fascism in Hungary, are we really asking the question about them whether they subscribe to a fascist ideology? I don't think so. What we are really asking, or we should be asking, in my opinion, is whether certain conditions that undermine that so-called fabled liberal moment in the 1920s are reproducing themselves in the context of political discourse and social views right now as well. And I think that is very important. So this is my call, generally speaking, and I've got about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to stay much, I'm not going to talk much longer. We need history more than ever. You would think a historian would say that. It's at least job protection. But beyond that, we need history more than ever, and we need a kind of history that is suspicious of grand narratives, of exceptionality, of continuity, of linearity and everything, but a history that remains empathetic with the past that it studies. When I mean empathetic, I don't mean ideologically, and I don't mean morally empathetic, I mean methodologically empathetic. And if you cannot fathom, as many people cannot, the proposition that somebody who is studying fascism, or Donald Trump, or Marine Le Pen, or Mussolini and Hitler, and all these characters, some of them unsavory, some of them very unsavory and so on, can approach the subject in empathetic terms, don't trust me. Trust, I call an unlikely witness in my defense. Antonio Gramsci, a hero of the Italian Communist Party, a hero of the left, one of the most nuanced intellectuals of the 20th century, regardless of political hue and ideological hue. He was arrested by the fascist regime in Italy in the 1920s. He was put in prison and basically rotted away in prison. But during his time in prison, he kept his notebooks, which of course have been published. And Gramsci is very interesting in my respect, from my narrative, because I think it's very interesting because he, for the first time, wrote something very interesting. He experienced the rise of the Great Revolution in Russia as he saw it, which, according to him and his analysis of the past, would have resulted in a worldwide socialist revolution, and that didn't happen. So Gramsci writes with disarming honesty and says, why did this happen? Why were we defeated? Why the historic moment? I talked about a liberal moment. It could have been a socialist moment. Why did this moment just wither away, disappear from our palm like sand? Why? Because there is something that he calls good sense and there is common sense. Good sense is what we, sometimes as historians or analysts, expect people to do, expect people to think, expect people to feel like. Well, common sense is probably quite close to this, but not always. And sometimes that common sense is quite different. And Gramsci said that was an error. We assumed that people would be instantly converted to a message of a good sense which was associated with his vision of the future. And it didn't happen. But here's the interesting thing. What is more important? It is to engage, and this is Gramsci, not me, to engage empathetically with that common sense of the people in order to change it. So not exceptionalize it, not turn it into something that came alien. The past is a foreign place. There you go. I mentioned my cliche for today, but turn it into something that you can study. You should try and understand in so many ways. I am running out of time, but I just wanted to say, I don't think you'll be able to see this one. My last call with regard to this kind of history is, it is a history that is not only suspicious of grand narratives. It's not only a history that seeks some kind of connections, patterns, and analogies. It's also a history that affords a significant place to contingency, to luck, to random events. I've used these two slides. This one is more serious. Causality can be a tricky counsel in many ways to historians. This is from the televised debate of the 1960s presidential election, and apparently, and I am calling on other people here, the particular presentation of Richard Nixon cost him quite a bit. There are a number of things where contingency really hits in rather unlikely cases, and this is definitely one of them as well, something that you cannot really predict in one way or another. We live in times where history has lost its metaphysical buttressing. We are suspicious of grand narratives of progress, of the inevitability of progress, and indeed of the mere suggestion, so popular in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, that fascism was defeated in 1945. The historian is not a prophet of the past, let alone of the future. So when I was approached by that journalist, I told them that I'm not sitting on a glass ball and I cannot see the future in that respect. And he shouldn't really be thinking about asking historians, but maybe other people who would like to put the reputation for looking into the future into jeopardy in that respect. I think the question is Donald Trump fascism is a silly one in that respect. But I wonder whether an interesting historical analogy we have to bring in mind is whether we are witnessing a second liberal moment, the kind of liberal moment that we exceptionalized since 1945, and it may be that liberal moment is showing its cracks under this veneer of the end of history, and so on and so forth. And what about of the historian in that respect? If our trade as historians has become devoid of metaphysics, so we are free agents and we do history, maybe not necessarily in conditions we want to make, but that's the way it is, then at least as historians we need to seek truths, we need to maintain our commitment to the most rigorous standards of historical scholarship. I think this is all very, very important, and I think we need, in that respect, to always, and I think this is, for me personally, one of my biggest tasks as historians, always to remind the people for whom we write history, for whom we study history, of the fragility, the contingency, and the reversibility of everything that has happened and everything that we're sitting on right now. If anything, and I'm not even sure that that is a lesson, let's call it lesson for the sake of argument and for concluding this, it is precisely that point. There are no final victories and there are no final defeats in history. Thank you very much. Just stay here.